Over the course of 2 days, as the atmosphere in Alien Demon City grew increasingly intense, nearing a state of madness, the long-awaited moment finally arrived. When the first ray of light tore through the clouds on the 3rd day, illuminating the earth, Alien Demon City erupted into chaos. The sky was filled with the piercing sound of air being sliced apart as figures shot through the air like locusts, rushing toward the entry point of the Alien Demon region. Not far to the north of Alien Demon City, the land had already transformed into an ominous shade of pitch black. A faint, unsettling aura emanated from the ground, causing discomfort even in one's soul. This region, known as the Alien Demon region, had been shrouded for centuries by an ancient and terrifying formation. It was said that many of the greatest experts of the time had come together to construct this formation, sealing off this land for countless years. However, nothing in this world is eternal. Despite the terror of the formation, with the passage of time, cracks had begun to appear, allowing people to enter and leave through certain points. One such point existed just outside Alien Demon City. It was a vast, black plain, and at the far end of it, the space twisted, creating a clear divide across the landscape. At that moment, the sky above the plain was packed with figures, and from the distance, more could be heard approaching rapidly. The crowd continued to swell, forming a sea of people that seemed to stretch endlessly. Swoosh! A large group of figures swept in and finally appeared 1,000 meters away from the spatial barrier. Their forms became visible. It was none other than the disciples of the Tao Sect, with Lin Dong among them. Incredible! Hovering in the air, everyone gazed around at the endless sea of people and couldn't help but click their tongues in awe. As expected from a grand event in the Eastern Mystery region, only the word vast could truly describe the scale of it. Lin Dong nodded in agreement, feeling deeply moved. Among the crowd that filled the skies, he could sense many hidden yet powerful presences. It was clear that this gathering was filled with formidable experts from all over. The Sect competition was indeed a gathering of the elite. As Lin Dong's gaze swept across the sky, it suddenly paused on a group of individuals carrying long swords on their backs. A sharp sword aura radiated from their bodies, as if it could pierce through heaven and earth. Lin Dong's eyes lingered on this group for a moment before focusing on the figure at the front. Though he didn't look particularly striking, the razor-sharp aura emanating from his body made even Lin Dong's gaze sharpen. That's a disciple of the Sword Sect. The one leading them is known as Sword Maniac Schwelling, the most talented of the current younger generation of the Sword Sect. He's at the peak of the 9th Nirvana stage and is said to have mastered the sword immortal art. His attack power is terrifyingly aggressive, explained EngSubs from beside Lin Dong as she also looked at the man. Oh! Lin Dong raised an eyebrow. He had heard of the sword immortal art before. It was said to be on par with the Emperor Scripture in terms of power. The group in white, and those disciples in yellow not far from them, are from the Divine Sect and Talisman Valley, respectively. This time, the strongest among the younger generation of the Divine Sect is a woman named Yuan, while the leader of the Talisman Valley disciples is called Mao Shan. Both of them have reached the level of 9-seal Heavenly Talisman Masters. Their methods of attack are elusive and extremely troublesome to deal with, EngSubs continued, pointing toward 2 other groups. Lin Dong followed her gaze. In front of the group in white stood a woman in a white dress, elegant and graceful. Her appearance was exquisite, but what left the deepest impression was her snow-white hair. As the wind gently blew, it danced like falling snowflakes, and the immense, invisible spiritual energy radiating from her distorted the space around her. Lin Dong's gaze lingered on the woman named Yuan for a moment before shifting toward the group from Talisman Valley. There, a young man in a bright yellow robe stood. His robe was covered in strange runes, and faint rays of light occasionally flashed from it. Judging from the way the spiritual energy surged around him, the yellow robe was clearly a powerful spirit treasure. The spiritual fluctuations radiating from his body were no weaker than those of the white-haired woman. 9-seal Heavenly Talisman Masters, Lin Dong clicked his tongue. At the moment, his spiritual energy was still at the level of a 6-seal Heavenly Talisman Master, far weaker than these 2. After all, Lin Dong had devoted more time to cultivating his primordial energy rather than his spiritual energy. Over there. Are those people from the ancient wilderness hall? Lin Dong mused aloud after surveying the scene, his gaze falling on another group. They were burly men, many of whom were bare-chested. Their bodies bulged with muscles, and their veins stood out like dragons. An ancient, primal energy pulsed from them, making them look like human-shaped beasts. Lin Dong's eyes swept over them before settling on the person at the front, and he blinked in surprise. At the forefront stood a rather slender man, who, in comparison to the hulking giants behind him, looked like a child. The contrast was so stark it almost seemed comical. However, Lin Dong's surprise was fleeting, quickly replaced by understanding, for the look of respect in the eyes of the brawny men behind the slender figure was unmistakable. That thin man is the senior disciple of the ancient wilderness hall, Wu Hong. Don't be fooled by his appearance. His body has been trained to an extremely powerful level. It's said that a 9th Nirvana stage expert once challenged him, only to have all his defenses shattered by a single punch. Even his Nirvana golden body was smashed, and he was gravely injured, EngSubs explained, nodding. Truly a gathering of monstrous talents, Lin Dong chuckled softly. The fact that these individuals were the best of their respective sects was proof enough of their talent and strength. This sect competition was indeed going to be interesting. EngSubs nodded but suddenly paused, her expression changing slightly as she looked off into the distance. The people from Nine Heavens Taiching Palace have arrived. Lin Dong also looked up, hearing the sound of wind being split in the distance. Moments later, a large group of figures appeared in the sky. With their arrival, the atmosphere above the plains stirred, and countless fervent gazes focused on the disciples of Nine Heavens Taiching Palace. At the front of the group was a graceful figure dressed in white, with an ethereal elegance, her demeanor as cool as ice. Qingzhu. Lin Dong couldn't help but rub his nose as he gazed at the arriving Qingzhu. As she appeared, he noticed that many of the elite disciples from the various sects, whom he had been observing, were now turning their eyes toward her, their admiration barely concealed. It seemed that what Qingzhu had mentioned 2 days ago was no exaggeration. Lin Dong's gaze swept past Qingzhu, and he suddenly let out a surprised sound as his eyes landed on a familiar figure behind her, a girl named Su Ro. At this moment, the girl was wearing a light blue dress, her beauty as delicate as ever. There was no trace of the timidness she once had. Instead, she wore a faint smile while conversing with her fellow disciples, looking confident and at ease. It seemed that the once shy girl, who had often seemed overwhelmed in Lin Dong's presence, had finally grown up. In the distance, Su Ro, who had been chatting with her fellow disciples, seemed to sense something. She raised her head, and her gaze fell in the direction of the Dao sect. There, she spotted a familiar face looking back at her with a gentle smile. Brother Lin Dong. Su Ro was momentarily stunned before her face lit up with surprise and excitement. She even disregarded the attention of those around her and waved toward Lin Dong in the distance. Seeing the joy on Su Ro's face, Lin Dong responded with a faint smile. Su Ro's actions were clearly noticed by the Dao sect disciples standing near Lin Dong, leaving them momentarily surprised. Then, they all cast admiring looks at him, wondering how this guy seemed to know people wherever he went. You sure do have a wide circle of friends. EngSubs couldn't help but shake her head, glancing over at Huan. The latter, however, was chatting with Qing Yi as if she hadn't noticed anything. Still, the keen-eyed EngSubs noticed her occasionally stealing glances toward the distance, showing she wasn't entirely indifferent. An old friend from the 100 Dynasty War, Lin Dong explained with a smile. He also cast a helpless glance at Huan, who had been giving him the silent treatment for a while. This young lady certainly knew how to hold a grudge. Meanwhile, at Nine Heavens Taiching Palace, Ling Qingzhu had also noticed Su Ro's gesture and asked softly, "You know him?" During the 100 Dynasty War, if it hadn't been for Brother Lin Dong, my brother and I wouldn't have made it to the 100 Dynasty Mountain, Su Ro replied with a smile. Brother Lin Dong is amazing. He came from a lower dynasty, but in the end, he won the 100 Dynasty War. And when the Western Mystery region tried to seize the ancient space, It was he who summoned 3 wind and thunder tribulations to drive them back, Su Ro added, her face full of admiration. The male disciples nearby couldn't help feeling a little envious, having never seen the usually highly respected Su Ro display such emotion. Ling Qingzhu nodded slightly, her long lashes lowering to conceal the faint ripple in her eyes. That guy. He certainly had gone through quite an extraordinary journey over the years. In the distance, Lin Dong gradually retracted his gaze from the 9 Heavens Taiching Palace and turned to look at another part of the sky. He murmured softly, "The Yuan sect is here." At his words, the expressions of the Dao sect disciples behind him grew slightly tense as they raised their heads and locked onto that part of the sky. Swoosh, swoosh. Amidst their focused stares, the sharp sound of the wind being sliced through filled the air. A large mass of figures appeared, like a dark cloud, charging in with an overbearing presence. They soon took up position closest to the distorted space. As this group of figures arrived, Lin Dong's gaze immediately turned toward the front of the Yuan sect disciples. There, 3 figures stood tall, exuding an overwhelming aura that caused many people's faces to change. The 3 minor kings of the Yuan sect, the most outstanding figures of the younger generation in the Eastern Mystery region. As the 3 most prominent participants in the sect competition, they had finally made their appearance. Hundreds of Yuan sect disciples formed a neatly arranged square formation in mid-air. A tremendous wave of power swept out from their bodies, converging into a massive force that even caused the sky to rumble with low, muffled thunder, drawing everyone's attention. At the front of the Yuan sect disciples stood the 3 figures. Though their combined presence wasn't as vast as the hundreds of disciples behind them, they stood like towering mountains before the Yuan sect disciples, making it impossible to ignore them. Lin Dong squinted slightly as he observed the 3 figures. He had already encountered little Lei King Lei Qian, so his gaze shifted to the left. There, a handsome young man in white stood, holding a folding fan that he waved leisurely. He had a refined, scholarly demeanor, but the surging energy radiating from him made it clear that anyone who mistook him for a harmless scholar would be gravely mistaken. "That's little Ling King, Ling Zhan," EngSubs said softly, her expression somewhat serious as she stared at the man in white. Lin Dong nodded slightly, his gaze equally serious. He could sense that this little Ling King, Ling Zhan, was even more dangerous than Lei Qian. The Yuan sect truly lived up to its reputation as the strongest sect in the Eastern Mystery region, a fact that was evident from the differences between the disciples of each sect. But among the 3 minor kings of the Yuan sect, the most formidable one isn't Lei Qian or Ling Zhan, but rather, Little Yuan King Yuan Song, EngSubs added, her voice tinged with a trace of hoarseness as she spoke the name. It was clear how much pressure that name exerted on her. Lin Dong silently nodded and shifted his gaze to Yuan Song, who stood between Lei Qian and Ling Zhan. The man in the blue robe didn't appear particularly remarkable, yet he stood there with a faint smile, looking nothing like the fierce and oppressive figure Lin Dong had imagined. However, despite Yuan Song's calm demeanor, the countless gazes focused on him made it clear that his presence commanded as much attention as that of Ling Qingzhu. Lin Dong glanced toward the other major sects and noticed that even the top disciples of those sects had slightly unnatural expressions upon seeing Yuan Song. A wary glint flashed in their eyes, revealing just how fearful they were of him. At that moment, Lin Dong had to admit that Yuan Song's presence was indeed powerful. As the leader of the 3 minor kings, his reputation was well-deserved. As countless eyes converged on Yuan Song, the blue-robed man tilted his head slightly, his gaze shifting toward the direction of the 9 Heavens Taiching Palace. More precisely, it landed on Ling Qingzhu, who stood upon a lotus of blue light. "Heh, as expected, Qingzhu, you're leading the 9 Heavens Taiching Palace this time. If we meet in the alien demon region, I hope you'll go easy on me," Yuan Song said with a gentle smile as he gazed at Ling Qingzhu. His face wasn't particularly handsome, but his calm and composed demeanor exuded a charm that made those around him feel at ease, lowering their guard without even realizing it. "Brother Yuan Song is too modest. I don't have such skill," Ling Qingzhu replied softly, her long lashes lowered. As she spoke, Ling Qingzhu's gaze briefly flickered in the direction of Lin Dong. Qingzhu is being humble. If you went all out, even I wouldn't be able to win so easily, Yuan Song said with a smile. His gaze then shifted slightly toward the Dao Sect disciples. The moment Yuan Song's gaze swept over, Lin Dong felt the tension rise among the Dao Sect disciples. Even EngSubs and Wang Yin couldn't help but circulate their primordial energy a little faster. EngSubs, Wang Yin. Haha, we're all old acquaintances, Yuan Song said with a smile, his gaze resting on them. EngSubs and Wang Yin's expressions darkened slightly. Although Yuan Song's tone was warm, they could feel the chilling, bloody intent lurking beneath the surface of his words. Seeing their reaction, Yuan Song chuckled again before his eyes settled on Lin Dong. His narrow eyes squinted slightly as he spoke. I've heard that the champion of this year's 100 Dynasty War rejected Yuan Sect's invitation and instead joined Dao Sect. It seems Dao Sect picked up quite the bargain. Yuan Song smiled, pausing briefly before continuing. But perhaps it's for the best. Better to be a big fish in a small pond than a small one in a big lake. Yuan Song's words immediately sparked anger in the eyes of many Dao Sect disciples. Was he implying that Lin Dong could only be a leader in Dao Sect and would have been insignificant in Yuan Sect? His seemingly gentle words were sharp and barbed, cutting to the bone. The noisy sky grew quiet as many from the various sects turned to watch. The deep-seated grudge between Dao Sect and Yuan Sect was no secret to those present. However, no one expected sparks to fly the moment the two sides met. But given the situation, it was clear that Dao Sect was at a disadvantage compared to Yuan Sect. At Nine Heavens Taiching Palace, Ling Qingzhu's brows furrowed slightly as she glanced at Su Rou. The latter's face was full of worry, clearly aware of the disparity between Dao Sect and Yuan Sect's disciples. To decide who's the big fish or small fry now seems a bit premature, Lin Dong responded with a light chuckle, not the slightest hint of fear in his voice. Back then, didn't Senior Zhou Tong of Dao Sect manage to beat your 3 minor kings of Yuan Sect, leaving 1 dead, 1 injured, and 1 on the run? Lin Dong's words immediately caused a stir in the sky, with many people looking surprised. Clearly, they hadn't expected Lin Dong to dare to confront Yuan Song so directly. You overestimate yourself. Do you think you're Zhou Tong? Lei Qian sneered. Even Zhou Tong couldn't escape being killed by Yuan Sect in the end, Little Ling King Lingjun said with a faint smile, gently waving his folding fan. It's truly remarkable that the head of Yuan Sect would stoop so low as to personally deal with a Dao Sect disciple, Lin Dong said with a grin. Hearing this, both Lingjun and Lei Qian frowned, their smiles stiffening. Back then, Zhou Tong was indeed only a disciple, but he had forced Yuan Sect's head to personally intervene to defeat him. This incident had attracted much mockery afterward, tarnishing Yuan Sect's reputation. It was a sore spot for the sect's disciples, and Lin Dong's words hit a nerve. Just as Lei Qian's face darkened and he was about to retort, Yuan Song, who stood in front of him, raised his hand slightly. His narrow eyes fixed on Lin Dong, though they still carried a smile. However, beneath that smile, there was an unmistakable chill. It seems we haven't disciplined Dao Sect's disciples enough over the years. Yuan Song smiled, shaking his head as his gaze, cold and serpentine, slowly swept over everyone from Dao Sect. In that case, you'd better pray for good fortune in this sect competition. His words weren't overtly threatening, but the malice within them was impossible to miss. There's no need for hasty conclusions. Some things are best left unsaid until the outcome is clear. Lin Dong's smile gradually faded as he spoke. His eyes gleamed with a dark light, and his hands clenched tightly in his sleeves. He knew that in this sect competition, he would have to give it his all. You've got guts, I like that, Yuan Song said with a faint smile. I'll make sure to remind you of those words when the time comes. Let's hope it's not the last thing you hear. With that, Yuan Song slowly withdrew his gaze. His fingers interlaced in front of him, and those familiar with his temperament, Lei Qian and Ling Zhan, began to smirk coldly. They knew that when Yuan Song reached this state, his killing intent had already peaked. It was clear, Lin Dong had provoked Yuan Song's murderous intent. Dao Sect was in for trouble. As Yuan Song turned away, Lin Dong did the same, casting a glance at EngSubs and the others. Instead of showing discontent over Lin Dong's confrontation with Yuan, their faces were filled with icy determination. Is Yuan the strongest of the younger generation in the Eastern Mystery region? Lin Dong asked softly. EngSubs hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. There's one more person who's just as strong. Who? The top name on the Sect bounty list, Ghost-Face Chun Kue, EngSubs replied. Chun Kue? Lin Dong frowned slightly. This was clearly a name he hadn't heard before. He's not a disciple of any sect, and he may not even be from the Eastern Mystery region. This person is elusive, and few know of his whereabouts. It's said that he once fought Yuan to a standstill. Wang Yin chimed in. I see. Lin Dong murmured to himself. It seemed that the Eastern Mystery region was truly full of hidden talents. He wondered if Chun Kue would show up for the Sect competition. The alien demon region is about to open, EngSubs suddenly said. Lin Dong looked up and saw ripples appearing in the spatial barrier in the distance. The alien demon region was indeed about to open. Meanwhile, far away, two streaks of light sped across the sky like lightning. Junior sister, there's no need to rush. We'll make it in time for the Sect competition. The figure in the rear called out helplessly as the light slowed down momentarily. The person revealed behind the light wore a half mask, giving him a rather eerie appearance. You're too slow. If you don't want to come, then don't follow me. I can go on my own, a crisp voice replied from the figure ahead, who sped up once more toward the horizon. The masked man could only smile bitterly and shake his head as he quickly followed. Their voices could be faintly heard as they conversed. Are you looking for someone, junior sister? Is this person important? But as for who it is, you'll know when we find him. Though, when we do find him, I'll probably get scolded. You'd better be smart about it, or I'll tell Master you didn't protect me well enough. Even Master wouldn't scold you. But him? All right then. On the vast, dark plain, the distorted space began to ripple like water, and a terrifying aura seeped out from within. The crowd on the plain grew restless once more, and countless fiery gazes fixed on the distorted space. Those familiar with the scene knew that these were the signs of the alien demon region's opening. As one of the most infamous regions in the Eastern Mystery region, the alien demon region was normally sealed off by an ancient formation. Only as time passed did cracks appear in the formation, weakening the seal. Now, every few months, the seal weakened significantly, making it the perfect time for treasure hunters to flood in. Just like now, the terrifying energy ripples spread across the sky at an astonishing speed, and the distant spatial barrier standing between heaven and earth grew increasingly distorted. Through the twisting space, glimpses of the dark, foreboding land within could be seen, and a cold, oppressive aura spread outwards. It's about to open. Lin Dong's gaze fixed on the twisted space with curiosity. This land, where an ancient battle between heaven and earth had once been fought, piqued his interest. Perhaps here, he could uncover the truth behind that ancient war and the unknown creatures those great experts had battled. When we enter the alien demon region, we must keep our energy linked. Otherwise, we risk being scattered upon entry. EngSubs said seriously, her gaze still on the increasingly distorted space. She turned toward the Dao Sect disciples, her expression grave. Yes. Hearing this, the Dao Sect disciples responded solemnly. Their expressions became more serious, clearly aware of the dangers within the alien demon region. If they were to be transported to one of its perilous areas alone, survival would be nearly impossible. We leave the same way we came? Lin Dong suddenly asked. In the depths of the alien demon region, there's a location where a formation has been set up. At the end, the disciples of the 8 super sects will converge there from all directions, EngSubs explained, pausing for a moment before continuing. When we reach that point, it's likely we'll have to face Yuan's sect. In the last sect competition, senior sister Wang fell victim to Yuan's sect, while covering the Dao Sect disciples' retreat from the formation. At this mention, Wang Yan's fists clenched tightly, the sound of knuckles cracking under pressure. A crazed fury could be seen flickering in his eyes. Lin Dong nodded, placing a comforting hand on Wang Yan's shoulder before asking again. In the alien demon region, Does anything go? Even killing disciples from other sects? The sect competition isn't a friendly exchange. It's a cold and ruthless battleground for tempering oneself. No one will hold you accountable for what happens here, but the grudges will accumulate in secret, EngSubs said softly. I see. Lin Dong murmured to himself, his eyes narrowing slightly. It was hard to tell what was going through his mind at that moment. Buzz. As Lin Dong and EngSubs spoke, the spatial barrier in the distance twisted to its limit and then suddenly exploded. A vortex of space rapidly formed in its place. Swoosh. The instant the vortex took shape, the air was torn apart by countless figures, surging forth like locusts, forming a torrent that rushed into the swirling vortex of space. Amid the frenzy, the disciples of the super sects began to move, their actions far more orderly than the chaos around them. Majestic waves of primordial energy surged out, wrapping around their disciples as they transformed into radiant beams of light, shooting toward the vortex. Let's go. Seeing this, EngSubs stepped forward, her clear voice ringing out to the Tao sect disciples. Yes. With a unified response, waves of powerful primordial energy emanated from the Tao sect disciples, merging together into a protective aura that enveloped them all. Move. EngSubs led the way, her figure shooting forward. Lin Dong, Wang Yin, and the rest of the Tao sect disciples followed closely behind. Encased in a vibrant beam of energy, the Tao sect disciples appeared as a cohesive whole, and under the watchful eyes of the surrounding crowds, they dove into the swirling vortex, vanishing without a trace. Even after the Tao sect disciples entered the alien demon region, the vast sea of people continued to pour in, the sound of wind being torn apart reverberating across the plain. High above alien demon city, Qi Lei, Chanzhan, and the others withdrew their gazes as they watched the Tao sect disciples disappear into the alien demon region. They exchanged glances, a mix of gravity and unspoken emotions reflected in their eyes. I wonder what will happen if they face off against Yuan sect again this time. The strength of Yuan sect's 3 minor kings is undeniable among the younger generation, Qi Lei said in a low voice. There's no need to sell ourselves short. Yuan sect may be powerful, but our Tao sect disciples are no pushovers. Besides, this time, we have our own little prodigy in tow, Chunzhan remarked with a faint smile. That kid, he's truly something. Before we left, the sect master mentioned that Lin Dong would be the biggest variable in this sect competition. It's the second time in 100 years that the sect master has said something like that. The first time was when Senior Zhou Tong was around, and now the second time, it's Lin Dong, Qi Lei chuckled, somewhat wistfully. This time, we'll see how that little prodigy fares against Yuan sect's 3 minor kings. I must say, I'm rather looking forward to it. The 4 of them exchanged glances again, their expressions lightening slightly. However, what they couldn't foresee was that the confrontation they anticipated would soon unfold in a blood-soaked manner, shaking the entire eastern mystery region. The darkness of the land spread out like a blanket, extending all the way to the horizon. It was so deep that even the sky seemed to grow oppressively dark, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. This was a land that had once witnessed one of the most brutal battles between heaven and earth. It was a dark wasteland. From time to time, piercing roars echoed from the distance, carrying no signs of life, only a pure, murderous intent. Swoosh. After a long period of silence, the sky above the wasteland suddenly split open with countless cracks. From these cracks, countless beams of light shot out, instantly breaking the stillness of the land. Amidst the flurry of light, a massive beam of rainbow light descended, slowly touching down on the ground. As the light faded, hundreds of figures were revealed, led by EngSubs and Lin Dong, the Tao sect disciples. So, this is the alien demon region? As they landed, the Tao sect disciples couldn't help but look around curiously, intrigued by this infamous and deadly place. Most people entering the alien demon region are randomly transported to its outer edges by the spatial vortex. Unless we're really unlucky, we shouldn't encounter Yuan sect too soon, EngSubs said as she scanned the surroundings. Understood. Lin Dong nodded. They had their own objectives in the alien demon region, and an early encounter with Yuan Sect would not be ideal. As for settling scores, that could wait until later. Let's move. Be careful. Lin Dong's eyes swept across the ground, and just as he was about to speak, his pupils suddenly contracted. He stomped his foot hard on the ground, unleashing a terrifying force that cracked the earth open. From the fissure beneath, dozens of black, spiked, sinister creatures with blood-red eyes emerged. Swoosh, swoosh. At the moment Lin Dong discovered the monsters hidden underground, the surrounding earth collapsed, and massive, sharp black spikes shot up from the ground, targeting the Dao Sect disciples. Having just landed, many of the Dao Sect disciples were caught off guard by the fierce assault. However, the more alert and skilled disciples swiftly reacted, their primordial energy surging as they hastily deflected the deadly spikes. Even EngHuan was momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden attack, and a larger number of these creatures swarmed toward her. While fending off several monsters, her expression changed as the ground beneath her feet cracked open, revealing razor-sharp claws reaching for her. A startled cry escaped her lips. Clang! Just as her cry rang out, a figure appeared in front of her like a phantom. His foot expanded rapidly, transforming into a dragon leg, and with a fierce stomp, the ground beneath them shattered. Boom! 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 The earth collapsed under his powerful strike, and the Dao Sect disciples' faces paled as they watched a horde of black, blood-eyed monsters surge from the fissure below, like a tide. Demon ants! How unlucky! EngSubs and the others frowned as they saw the mass of black demon ants. They hadn't expected to encounter such troublesome creatures immediately upon arriving in the alien demon region. The ground trembled as it continued to cave in, and the demon ants, each roughly the size of a person, emerged in waves. Their sharp claws gleamed with a chilling light, and they emitted a powerful energy. Clearly, these creatures possessed formidable strength. However, it wasn't just the Dao Sect disciples who were under attack. Not long after the commotion spread, cries of alarm and screams of pain echoed from the distance. It seemed others had already fallen victim to the demon ants. In an instant, the black wasteland descended into chaos. Boom! Boom! Lin Dong wielded his black tree weapon, sweeping it with brutal force, shattering the bones of the charging demon ants. Though his attacks were fierce, the demon ants were relentless, continuing to swarm forward. Their sheer numbers caused Lin Dong to frown deeply. After the initial panic, the Dao Sect disciples began to demonstrate their strength as members of a super sect. Working together, they managed to fend off the demon ants' attacks. However, several were still injured, though fortunately not fatally. These demon ants are incredibly numerous and resilient. If we get bogged down here and exhaust our primordial energy, we'll be devoured by them. EngSubs said, frowning as she muttered to herself. But why are they appearing on the outskirts of the alien demon region? They're usually only found in the central areas. This is going to be tough, Lin Dong muttered as he observed the overwhelming swarm of black ants. He hadn't expected to encounter such a challenging situation right after entering the alien demon region. It lived up to its fearsome reputation. If he were alone, escaping would be easy, but he had to protect his fellow Dao Sect disciples. EngSubs and Wang Yin were also deep in thought, trying to come up with a strategy to escape. Why are all these damn things coming straight at me? EngHuan's face turned pale as she yelled in frustration. Hearing her complaint, Lin Dong and the others glanced over and noticed that a disproportionate number of demon ants were indeed swarming toward EngHuan. The sharp claws capable of shredding a nirvana golden body were aiming straight at her vital points. Lin Dong was briefly stunned, his eyes narrowing as he pondered. These demon ants weren't highly intelligent, yet their target was unusually specific. EngHuan wasn't the strongest among them, so why were they so fixated on her? Could it be that their instincts recognized her as the most dangerous among them? Lin Dong frowned. Although EngHuan was a reincarnator, she had yet to awaken. He didn't believe these low-intelligence demon ants could sense her hidden identity as a reincarnator. So, what was it? As Lin Dong's thoughts raced, his eyes suddenly sharpened. Aside from her reincarnator identity, There was something else that Huan possessed that the rest of them didn't. Sound waves. Huan, use your sound wave technique to put them to sleep. Lin Dong called out, appearing beside Huan in an instant. Swinging his black tree weapon, he smashed several demon ants to pieces and spoke in a low voice. My soundwave hypnosis? But anyone with a bit of spiritual power can resist it, Huan said, startled. These creatures don't possess any spiritual power. To others, they're like savage beasts, but to you, they'll be defenseless, Lin Dong explained. When he shattered the demon ants earlier, he sensed that they lacked any spiritual power. Huan hesitated for a moment before nodding. Her delicate hand raised, and an ancient green zither appeared in a flash. With a light pluck of her jade-like fingers, a gentle melody with a strange resonance spread outward. Plop, plop, plop. As soon as the music reached the demon ants, Lin Dong and the others watched in amazement as the once ferocious creatures slowed down. Moments later, they collapsed like cut-down grass, falling unconscious. Everyone stared in disbelief as the tide of ants, which had nearly trapped them in a perilous situation, was completely subdued by Huan's melody. It was a clear example of how everything had its natural counter. Who would have thought that this deadly swarm of demon ants, which even Lin Dong hesitated to engage directly, would be completely defeated by Huan's music? Let's go. Lin Dong, Xiao, and the others let out a sigh of relief. With a quick shout, they prepared to lead the group away from the dangerous area. Wait, sister. I think there's something under the ground. Huan suddenly said, her voice hesitant. Huh. Lin Dong, Xiao, and Wang Yin all froze, their steps faltering as they turned to look at Huan with puzzled expressions. Huan furrowed her brows slightly and swiftly plucked the zither strings with her jade-like fingers. A powerful sound wave shot out, and everyone watched as the black tide of demon ants parted like a giant hand sweeping them aside, revealing the dark ground beneath. As the swarm dispersed, they saw a large patch of brownish rock deep underground, and upon closer inspection, there appeared to be several figures sitting cross-legged atop the stone. What is that? Lin Dong and the others stared in astonishment at the figures seated below. After a moment, they realized that these were not living beings but rather dried-up corpses. Lin Dong, look at their energy cores. Xiao said softly. Lin Dong followed her gaze and his eyes narrowed sharply. In the energy cores of those corpses, he could see a faint white glow. Within that glow, a small orb spun slowly, radiating an immense life force. Is that a life mystique bone pearl? My goodness, these corpses must have been at the great completion, or even the peak of the life mystique stage when they were alive. Wang Yan's face showed clear amazement, his voice low but filled with awe. Life mystique bone pearls formed when the life force of powerful life mystique stage experts condensed after their death. These pearls contained vast amounts of vitality and were highly attractive to experts at the peak of the 9th nirvana stage. If one had enough fortune, absorbing this pearl could even allow someone to glimpse the threshold of the life mystique stage. Such an item would be extremely rare and valuable outside of the alien demon region. To think they would encounter it so soon after entering. Faced with such a treasure, even Lin Dong's eyes couldn't help but light up with fiery desire. No wonder there's such a massive swarm of demon ants here. It's the life mystique bone pearls that drew them, Xiao said in sudden realization. Shall we take them? Wang Yin asked, looking toward Lin Dong and Xiao. The two exchanged a glance, gritting their teeth slightly before nodding. Since they had come across such a treasure, there was no reason to let it slip through their fingers. Huan hesitated as she watched the three prepare to act. Her large eyes flicked back toward the dried corpses below, and for some reason, a sense of unease flickered in her gaze. Swoosh! Just as Lin Dong, Xiao, and Wang Yin were about to make their move, a sharp sword hum suddenly echoed from the distance, causing the Dao Sect disciples to turn their heads in surprise. In the distance, brilliant light surged, and that light coalesced into a massive sword of energy. The sword cut through the sea of demon ants with astonishing speed and appeared above Lin Dong and his group. The Sword Sect? Lin Dong's eyes narrowed slightly as he stared at the enormous sword. Haha, I was wondering why such a large swarm of demon ants would appear in the outskirts of the alien demon region. It seems there's a reason after all. In midair, the light of the sword gradually faded, revealing a large group of people. At the front stood a man in gray robes, smiling as he gazed down at Lin Dong and the others. His eyes soon shifted, locking onto the brown rock deep underground where the corpses lay, his gaze filled with unmistakable greed. The Dao Sect disciples tensed up at the sight of the Sword Sect's arrival, their eyes flashing with caution. Subtle waves of primordial energy began to ripple out from their bodies. The gray-robed man's eyes flickered as he studied Lin Dong's group, then he smiled and said, "I'm Xueling from the Sword Sect. Friends from Dao Sect, how about we split the life mystique bone pearls evenly between us?"